It was the winter of 1872 when the letter arrived, though the story it contained began nearly 40 years earlier. I still remember the feel of the brittle envelope in my hands, yellowed at the edges, sealed with a wax stamp that had half crumbled in the cold. I wasn't expecting mail, let alone from someone I didn't know. The name on the return address, Elijah Cartwright, meant nothing to me at the time. And yet, the moment I slit the envelope open with my blade, something inside me shifted. The handwriting was unsteady, as if written by a man either very old or very afraid. The message was brief but disturbing. If you care for truth and decency, come to Marion County, Virginia. They were never buried proper. That was it. No explanation, no signature beyond his name. Just a quiet summons from a dying place I had no connection to. But something about the way it was written, it didn't feel like a request. It felt like a confession waiting to be uncovered. At the time, I worked as a typesetter for a newspaper in Baltimore, a dull life filled with ink-stained fingers and stories that meant little beyond deadlines. I had no family left, no one to miss me if I took off for a few days. Still, I hesitated. Who sends a letter like that, after nearly 4 decades, and what wasn't buried proper? I carried that note in my coat pocket for 2 days before making a decision. The unease of not knowing gnawed at me worse than the fear of what I might find. Eventually, I packed a small bag, wrapped the letter in oilcloth, and boarded the first southbound train. It felt foolish at first, chasing shadows and cryptic warnings, but somewhere deep in my gut, I knew this wasn't just about uncovering a story. Something had gone wrong in Marion County, something that needed to be told, and perhaps put to rest. I arrived at the depot just past dusk, stepping off the train into a chill that smelled like wet leaves and coal smoke. Marion County was quiet, the kind of place where strangers stuck out like fire in a cornfield. The station master barely looked me in the eye when I asked about Elijah Cartwright. Used to live up near the old Sullivan place, he muttered before turning away, as if he regretted saying even that much. That was the first time I heard the Sullivan name spoken with discomfort, almost like it carried weight. I pocketed the clue and found a room above a tavern down the lane. That night, as the wind clawed against the windows, I pulled the letter out again. I stared at it until the candle burned low. They were never buried proper. What kind of man writes something like that and waits decades to say it? I didn't know yet, but I was about to find out, and whatever I uncovered in that cold Virginian town would change me forever. The morning fog sat low over Marion County like a curse. As my hired cart rattled along the muddy roads, I could barely make out the tops of the trees beyond the fields. Everything felt waterlogged. The ground, the air, even the silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet you find in peaceful towns. It was dense, like something was being held back. The driver was a gaunt man, who answered my questions with nods or shrugs. When I asked about the Sullivan place, he froze for half a second, just enough to notice, before murmuring, "Ain't no one lives out that way now." His eyes didn't meet mine after that. I didn't press. We crossed a narrow bridge over a stream that smelled of iron, and I swear I saw something, a child maybe, or the shadow of one, standing in the tree line. But when I looked again, it was gone. I was dropped off in front of a clapboard inn just outside town. The innkeeper, Mrs. Bellamy, was a stout, pale woman with eyes like chipped glass. She greeted me with that same tight-lipped expression everyone here seemed to wear. I signed the guest ledger, and her pen paused when I wrote my last name. "You ain't family to the Cartwrights, are you?" she asked. I shook my head, just answering a letter. That seemed to worry her more than if I'd said yes. She handed me the key, warned me about the creek flooding at night, and said nothing else. My room smelled like cedar and old wallpaper paste. There was a Bible on the nightstand, but the cross on its cover had been scratched halfway off. When I pulled open the curtain, I had a view straight down the road, and in the far distance, half lost in fog, a crooked iron fence that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I didn't know it yet, but that was the edge of the Sullivan property. That first day, I wandered the town square, trying to read the faces of those who passed me. Some glanced with suspicion, others not at all. At the general store, I asked the owner, a wiry man named Darnell, if he knew Elijah Cartwright. He paused while wrapping my tobacco pouch, and said, "He was a grave tender, I reckon, didn't keep company." Then he looked around and added, quieter, "They never let him bury the ones from that house. Not proper." He handed me my change and turned to help another customer, leaving me with more questions than answers. As I stepped outside, the church bell tolled once. No service, no gathering, just a single hollow note. The sky had turned gray again, and somewhere behind me, a dog barked once, then stopped abruptly. I felt it again, that feeling that something in this place had curled up and died, and no one dared speak of it. I first laid eyes on the Sullivan house from a ridge behind the churchyard, where the earth sloped down into a shadowed hollow. It was early evening, and the fog had started to gather again, thick and slow, curling around gravestones like breath. To beyond the headstones, past a patch of bare twisted oaks, the house stood crooked and quiet, weather-beaten boards, a roof slumped like tired shoulders, and tall black windows that watched the valley like open wounds. It didn't look abandoned so much as forgotten, a place the world had chosen to leave behind. I hadn't meant to find it, not that soon. I was walking to clear my thoughts when a young boy, barefoot and dusty, pointed down the hill without a word, just as I passed him. By the time I turned to ask what he meant, he was already gone, swallowed by the brush and the cold, and somehow I knew what he'd wanted me to see. Back at the inn, I asked Mrs. Bellamy directly, what happened at the Sullivan place. Her eyes snapped up like I'd struck a match too close to dry hay. She didn't answer at first, just folded a towel with stiff, jerky hands. "It's not a place for outsiders," she finally said. "They had their troubles. Best left alone." That was the first time I heard that phrase, "best left alone," and I'd hear it again, from nearly every soul in Marion. I asked if Elijah Cartwright ever visited there. She hesitated, then gave a short nod. "He walked that hill every Sunday, never said why, never came back clean." Her words settled heavy on the air. I went back to my room, sat at the desk, and wrote everything down. The boy on the hill, the house, Bellamy's warning. I had the sense I was collecting pieces of something shattered long ago, something no one wanted put back together. That night, I had a dream. Or maybe it was something worse. I saw a child staring out from one of those tall black windows. His face was pale, with dirt smudged beneath the eyes, and a chain at his ankle, gleaming in the moonlight like silver wire. Behind him, shadows moved. I woke up drenched in sweat, the blanket twisted tight around my legs. Outside, the wind howled low through the trees, like something wounded. I lay awake until dawn, the echo of the dream still clinging to my skin. When I finally rose, I went straight to the general store again. This time Darnell wouldn't even look up. "You've been near that house, haven't you?" he asked quietly, without greeting. "People don't come back the same." I didn't answer him. I just bought a lantern, a coil of rope, and a new notebook. I didn't know yet what waited in that house, but I'd already crossed the line. There was no turning back now. It was a slow, bitter morning in the general store. The windows were fogged with the breath of the fire inside, and the smell of smoked meat and damp wool hung thick in the air. Locals came and went, their boots thudding against the worn wooden planks, their eyes sliding past me like I was no one. I stood near the back, pretending to browse shelves of tinned preserves, when I heard it, low voices almost hushed, not meant for anyone but themselves. Two old men stood near the barrel of potatoes, speaking close. I couldn't catch everything, but I heard the word basement, and the name Sullivan. One of them glanced toward me, and lowered his voice even more. That was enough. I stepped closer, picking up a jar I didn't want, and strained to listen. Cartwright tried to tell someone. One whispered, said they was chained like dogs down there, said he saw it with his own eyes. The other shook his head, and that's why they stopped letting him bury folks. Man knew too much. I must have made a noise, maybe shifted my foot or breathed too loudly, because both men looked straight at me, sudden and sharp. The store felt colder then, even with the fire. One of them, the taller of the two, narrowed his eyes. "You not from here?" he said flatly. I nodded, and tried to play dumb. "Just passing through. Heard the Sullivan name come up. That an old family around these parts." The shorter man grunted. "Old's one word for it, wrong's another." Then he picked up a sack of feed and turned away. The conversation was over, just like that. But I had what I needed. Confirmation that Elijah Cartwright had spoken to someone, and that others had heard. That basement wasn't a rumor. It was real. Something had happened there, and Cartwright had carried the memory, like a sickness. As I walked out, Darnell caught my arm. His hand was rough and cold. "You ought to leave," he muttered. "You think you're here to help, or to write it all down. But there's things that get inside a man, things you can't put on paper." His eyes searched mine, not with anger, but pity. I nodded, just to be polite, and walked out with my notebook under my coat. Outside, the sky was the color of ash, and the church bell struck twice. I didn't hear any birds. The streets were almost empty. From the distance behind the fog-covered ridge, I thought I heard something faint, a metallic clinking sound, like chains shifting against stone. Maybe it was in my head, maybe it wasn't. Either way, I turned back toward the inn, my mind racing with the weight of all I'd heard. The Sullivan house wasn't just haunted by silence, it was haunted by memory, by blood, and by something deeper, something still alive beneath the ground. I found her in the back room of the church, folding linen cloths near the altar, like she'd been doing it for a lifetime. Mrs. Ada Cartwright, Elijah's sister-in-law, though some whispered she was more than that. Her hands were knotted and red with arthritis, but she moved with care, like each motion had weight. I had to introduce myself twice before she looked up at me. Her eyes were cloudy, but alert, pale like smoke. I told her I'd received a letter from Elijah weeks ago, and her shoulders tightened as if I'd reached inside her. "He shouldn't have written you," she said quietly. "That house, it's not meant to be remembered." I sat across from her, the wood of the pew cold even through my coat. I didn't speak for a moment. I let the silence stretch, and finally, she continued without being asked. "They brought the children there in wagons," she said, barely louder than breath. "Some were bought, some were taken. No names, no records, just silence." She looked past me, as if watching something rise in the air. "Elijah found them by accident. He was sent to prepare a burial for one of the Sullivan boys, a child who died of fever, they said. But when he arrived, there was no grave, just the door to the basement, open like a mouth." Her voice trembled, and she folded her hands to stop the shaking. "He said it was dark, even with the lantern, too quiet. But then he heard it. The chains, dozens of them, dragging." She didn't cry, her tears must have dried decades ago. "He ran. He told the sheriff, the pastor, even the mayor. But the town, they made him stop. Said if he opened his mouth again, they'd put him in the ground beside those children." I asked if he ever tried again. Her eyes finally met mine, cold and sharp. "He tried. That letter he sent you, that was the last thing he ever wrote. He died 2 days later, alone." Her voice dropped. "You're here now. You've stepped into something you can't walk back from. The ground won't let go." She reached beneath her chair and pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle, placing it into my hands. This was his. "Maybe you'll understand more than he did." I unwrapped it in the inn that night. A worn journal, leather cracked with age, filled with trembling ink and pages that smelled like smoke. The first line read, "They weren't ghosts. They were still breathing." My fingers trembled. I closed the book and listened. Outside, the wind howled like it was mourning something deep underground. It wasn't on any map. The Sullivan estate didn't appear in county records or property books, and when I asked for directions, all I got were stares or muttered warnings. Eventually I followed what Elijah had written in his journal, a crude drawing of the town, a narrow deer path through the woods, and a broken stone, marked with 3 slashes carved into its face. I found it just after noon, when the sun had burned off the fog and left the woods strangely still. No bird song, no rustling, just silence, the kind that feels thick in your throat. The path was overgrown, but not impassable. It had once been traveled, maybe often, long ago. The further I went, the colder the air grew, like the trees themselves were trying to keep the sun out. And then, just past a bend in the trail, I saw it, the Sullivan house, slumped in the middle of a clearing, like a carcass long since picked clean. The house was massive, built in the federal style, but sinking with age. Half the shutters were missing, and ivy clawed up the sides like it wanted to pull the place back into the earth. The porch sagged, and one of the beams hung crooked, like a broken limb. The tall windows were all black, smeared with dirt from the inside, as if someone had tried to look out. I stood at the edge of the clearing, heart racing, the notebook clutched tight in my hand. It looked exactly as I'd seen it in the dream. The angles, the emptiness, the sense of being watched. I stepped closer, my boots sinking slightly into the wet moss, and noticed something strange. No footprints, no animal tracks. Nothing alive had passed through here in years. And yet, the front door creaked ever so slightly in the breeze, as if it had just been used. I didn't go inside, not yet. I walked slowly around the perimeter, taking notes, drawing what I saw in my journal. The back of the house faced a low ridge, where rusted fencing stood, barely upright, enclosing what had once been a garden. I saw a dry well, its stones blackened. I saw a shed, collapsed in on itself, like a caved-in lung. But it was the cellar doors that drew me, set into the earth, warped wood bound by iron hinges, nearly buried in weeds. I didn't touch them, just stood there, staring, while a deep hum seemed to fill my chest. Not sound, not quite, more like pressure, like the ground was holding its breath. I turned away before the sun dipped too low, and made my way back to town. I knew I'd have to return, but next time, I wouldn't just look, I'd go inside. I returned to the inn just after sundown, mud caked on my boots, the Sullivan house still clawing at the edge of my mind. The tavern below the inn was quiet, lit by the glow of oil lamps and the occasional flicker from the hearth. A few locals sat hunched at tables, murmuring over bowls of stew. I ordered something warm, and sat alone, the journal in my lap, unopened. My appetite had gone, but I forced the food down, needing something to anchor me. As I ate, I noticed a woman across the room watching me. Her hair was gray, her dress plain, but her eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone trying to mind their own business. She nodded once, slow and deliberate. I nodded back, then she stood and left without a word. I never saw her speak to anyone else, but when I got up to leave, there was something tucked beneath my bowl, a matchbox and a scrap of paper that read only, "Don't trust the ground, it remembers." That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind groaned against the shutters like an old man in pain, and the room felt too still, too heavy. I lit a candle, and opened Elijah's journal again, flipping to a passage marked with a thin red ribbon. He wrote about a dinner he once attended at the Sullivan house, back in 1833. According to him, the family had been well respected once, distant, but wealthy, and prone to holding long dinners that only a few in town were ever invited to. He described the dining room in great detail, a table long enough to seat 20 oil portraits of children who never aged, and food that was prepared but never eaten. It was like theater, he wrote. Every course untouched, every glass full. They stared at the chairs across from them, as if expecting someone or something to arrive. He ended that entry with a sentence that made my blood run cold. The basement door was always bolted during dinner, but the floorboards beneath our feet, they thumped like something crawling just below. I don't know how long I stared at those words, long enough that the candle guttered, and the shadows in the corners seemed to twitch. I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. The old floor creaked, not loudly, but just once, enough to make me freeze. I turned, slowly, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I'd stepped too far into something, that maybe I was no longer an observer. I blew out the candle and climbed into bed with my boots still on, listening to the wind, the floor, the silence. In the space between dreams, I thought I heard a voice, young, trembling, just one word: help. I returned to the Sullivan house the following day. I don't remember deciding to. It was as if the morning air pulled me there, thick with that same heaviness that lived in Elijah's words. I arrived just after noon, lantern in one hand, the journal in the other, and stood for a moment in the overgrown path, before pushing the warped front door open. It groaned beneath my hand, resisting like a body not ready to be disturbed. The smell inside hit me first: mold, dust, and something faintly sweet, like rotted fruit. The foyer was choked with cobwebs, and the wallpaper had peeled in long curling strips like shed skin. The silence was nearly unbearable. My boots echoed too loudly on the hardwood floor. I half expected someone to come down the stairs at any moment, but no one did. There were only the creaks of the house settling, and beneath them something subtler, like breathing that wasn't mine. The staircase was broad and grand once, though now warped by time, every step protesting under my weight. Halfway up, I stopped. There was a door set just beneath the first landing, small, narrow, almost hidden, positioned too low to be a closet, and too heavy to be anything casual. The doorknob was brass and colder than the rest of the house. I crouched, heart thudding, and tried to turn it. Locked. I pressed my ear against the wood, and for the briefest second, I thought I heard something shift on the other side. Not loud, just a drag, like a chain pulling across stone. I stumbled back, and nearly dropped the lantern. My breathing turned shallow. That was no draft. Someone, or something, was behind that door. Elijah had written of it in his journal. Beneath the first landing was the trap they sealed. That's where they kept the ones who disobeyed, the ones who cried too loud. I touched the door again, felt the scratch marks near the bottom, 4 deep gouges, the size of fingernails, old but unmistakably real. I didn't have the tools to break the lock, and perhaps I was grateful for that. A part of me didn't want to open it yet. I wasn't ready, not alone. I backed away, slow and careful, my lantern casting long shadows that danced up the walls like ghosts reaching for air. As I stepped outside, I realized the sun was already setting, though it had only been mid-afternoon. The Sullivan house didn't keep time like the rest of the world. It moved to the rhythm of something buried, something that remembered every chain, every child, every name no one dared speak. That night was the worst so far. I tried to sleep, truly. I lay beneath the stiff wool blanket of my in-room, the fire down to a few flickering coals, the journal shut tight beneath my pillow. But something in me wouldn't rest. My ears strained against the silence, waiting, anticipating, and then it came, soft, deliberate, unmistakable, a scratching. Not the random creaks of an old building, not the wind scraping branches across the roof. This was slow, repetitive, almost careful, like someone tracing the same path over and over with their fingernail. It was coming from behind the wall near the headboard. I held my breath. The sound continued, 3 scratches, a pause, then 3 more. It wasn't the sound that frightened me most. It was the intention in it. Someone was trying to communicate, or to escape. I pressed my ear against the wall, and felt a cold spot, unnaturally cold. I whispered, without even knowing why, "Hello." There was no answer, just silence. Then the scratching resumed. Faster this time, more urgent. I bolted upright, pulling the journal from beneath the pillow, and flipping through Elijah's entries. Toward the back, I found one I hadn't seen before, a hastily scrawled note, unnumbered, written in the margins. "They follow, even in the walls. Once you know, they know you too." My hand trembled. I grabbed my coat and left the room, nearly stumbling down the stairs into the empty tavern. The fire had gone out, and the only sound was the ticking of the long case clock by the door. Even that felt louder than it should have. I sat there for nearly an hour, watching the shadows stretch and bend, waiting for morning like it was salvation. When I finally returned to my room, the scratching had stopped. The wall was still cold but silent. I tried to rationalize it. Mice, maybe, old pipes, imagination. But something deep in my gut told me otherwise. I examined the wooden paneling, where I'd heard the sound. One plank had a small crack, and inside I could see something tucked within, a strip of cloth, stained dark. I pulled it out with tweezers from my bag. It was no bigger than a child's handkerchief, torn at the edges. Embroidered in the corner, faded but still legible, were the initials, CJ. I didn't know it yet, but I'd find those same initials carved into the walls of the Sullivan basement days later. That night, I slept with the lantern burning at my bedside, and Elijah's journal clutched like a Bible. Something had awakened, and it knew I was listening. The next morning, I returned to the Sullivan house, compelled by something I couldn't explain. My hands were raw from the cold, my thoughts muddy with lack of sleep, but the air felt charged, like the land itself was holding its breath. I brought tools this time, a crowbar, extra lantern oil, and the cloth with the initials CJ folded in my coat pocket. The house creaked under my steps as I moved inside. I didn't go straight to the locked door beneath the staircase. Instead, something pulled me toward the parlor. It was a long room, filled with dust-heavy drapes and cracked portrait frames. One of them lay shattered on the ground, a painting of a young girl with braided hair and a blank expression. I knelt to gather the shards, and noticed something strange about the floor beneath it. The boards were uneven, one slightly raised like it had been forced upward and settled back down unevenly. I pried it open with the crowbar, slow and careful. The board creaked, resisted, then gave way. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled cloth and bound with twine, was another journal, not Elijah's, but smaller and older. I unwrapped it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred things. The cover was soft leather, nearly worn through, and the first page bore no name, just a date, September 12, 1833. The handwriting was smaller, more delicate, childlike, and what I read in those first few pages chilled me, deeper than anything yet. The writer spoke of the cold room, of waking up hungry, of the sounds in the walls. The journal was a confession, a cry for help etched in silence. "We are still here," one line read. "They say we are not real, that we are shadows, but I still feel the chain." I sat there on the dusty floor, lantern flickering beside me, reading until my eyes ached. The entries were disjointed, like the child had written in stolen moments. Some lines didn't make sense. Others were scratched out violently, but the pain bled through. Names appeared: Clara, Josiah, Emmett, Ruth, always followed by Mark's tally lines, crossed names, empty boxes. It was a record, I realized, of the children, a hidden ledger, but written in a child's frightened hand instead of ink and numbers. One page had a crude drawing of the house. The basement was circled, labeled, no light, no sound. At the bottom of the last page, written with what looked like dried blood, was a single sentence: "They are still down there." My skin crawled. The air had turned heavy again. I wrapped the journal tight and fled the room. But even as I stepped back into the cold daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling I'd just disturbed something that was never meant to be touched again. That night, I didn't return to the inn. I couldn't. Something in me knew I wouldn't sleep, and if I did, the dreams would be worse. I stayed in the church, tucked in a wooden pew near the back, where the light from the altar candles reached just far enough to keep the shadows from swallowing me. It was quiet for a time, comfortably so, but just after midnight, I began to hear the voices. At first, they were indistinct, more like breath on wood or wind curling under a door. But then, one by one they came clearer. Children's voices, whispering, soft, familiar and terrifying all at once. They spoke in half-formed sentences, asking questions I couldn't answer. Is it morning? Can we go now? Why don't they open the door? Their tones weren't angry or frightening. They were tired, weary in a way no child should ever be. I rose from the pew and followed the sounds, not outside but deeper into the church, toward the back room where the linens were kept. The air grew colder with each step, and though I should have been afraid, I wasn't, not exactly. I felt watched, yes, but not threatened. I paused in the narrow hallway and whispered, "Who are you?" The answer came not in words but in feeling, an overwhelming sense of being buried, forgotten. I stepped inside the linen room, where Ada Cartwright had once folded cloth and offered warnings, and there on the floor beneath the wooden bench, I saw dust disturbed, fresh despite the age of everything around it. I knelt and brushed it aside to reveal a child's shoe, small, scuffed, still holding the shape of its last owner. It was too old to have been left by any child in recent years, too small for coincidence. I cradled it in my hand, and that's when the whisper came again, close and clear. She never let us leave. I turned sharply. No one there, just shadows in the candlelight, but I could feel it. Those children, or what was left of them, circling the places they once knew, drifting like dust, and with them came the truth I hadn't wanted to face. This wasn't just a story of cruelty, of chains and basements. This was a story of voices silenced for so long. They began to echo in the walls themselves. I clutched the shoe, placed it beside the child's journal in my bag, and made my way back out into the night. The moon was veiled in clouds, and in the far distance past the woods, the Sullivan house stood like a broken tooth in the dark, waiting. I realized then those children weren't haunting me, they were guiding me, calling me toward what came next, the moment when I would open the cellar and finally see what they could never unsee. The Sullivan cellar had waited long enough. That morning the fog was thicker than ever, swallowing the trees and silencing the birds. I returned to the house with a crowbar, fresh lantern oil, a coil of rope, and both journals, Elijah's and the child's. The sky felt lower than usual, like the clouds were pressing down on the land, daring me to go through with it. When I reached the clearing, the air changed. It always did near the Sullivan estate. The cold had weight, the silence hummed. I moved to the back of the house, where the twin cellar doors sat half sunken into the earth, swallowed by years of rot and ivy. I knelt, peeled away the growth, and wedged the crowbar beneath the rusted hinge. It groaned, screamed almost, as if the wood itself didn't want to let go. And then snap, the first hinge gave, then the second. The doors dropped open with a force that sucked the warmth out of the air. I stared down into blackness. The stench hit first, thick and sweet and ancient, the smell of mold, decay, and something else I can only describe as grief. I lit the lantern and lowered it into the dark. The flame flickered violently, as though gasping. I followed it, one boot after the other, down the slick stone steps. The temperature dropped by degrees with every breath. The ceiling was low, the walls slick with damp, and the chains, God, the chains hung in rows from iron rings driven into the walls. They were still fastened. Most hung empty, but some weren't. In the far left corner, I saw bones, tiny, fragile, half swallowed by the earth, not buried, not laid to rest, just left. A rusted cup sat beside one of the chains, filled with crumbled bits of bread that had turned to stone. A child's rag doll lay face down in the corner, its mouth sewn shut with red thread. My legs nearly gave out. I knelt, shaking, and touched one of the manacles. It was cold, not just in temperature. It radiated something. I can't explain it, except to say it felt like touching absence, like the shape of a child's suffering left behind. The air was so heavy, I had to remind myself to breathe. And then, I heard it, faint at first, then louder, metal dragging against stone, not from memory. From the far side of the room, I raised the lantern, hand trembling. The chains there were moving, slowly, deliberately, and a voice, young and broken, whispered, "Please don't close the door again." I stumbled back up the stairs, the sound of dragging echoing behind me. I didn't shut the cellar. I left it open, the wind clawing at the doors, as I ran from the clearing. The children were still there, not alive, not ghosts, but something in between, and now they knew I had seen them. Now, they would not let me leave unchanged. For days I couldn't rid myself of the smell. It wasn't just in my clothes or hair. It felt lodged in my lungs like something had crawled in and made a home. I scrubbed my hands until they bled, burned the boots I wore in the cellar, even threw away the lantern. None of it helped. The scent of rusted iron mixed with something deeper, more biological decay, that went beyond death. It was a stench that clung to memory. At the inn the other boarders began to avoid me. The landlady would wrinkle her nose when I walked by, though she said nothing. But it wasn't just the smell that disturbed her, it was my eyes. I saw it in the mirror too, how the pupils had taken on a deeper shadow, as if what I'd seen underground had rooted itself behind them. I tried to write, to make sense of it. Elijah's journal, the child's journal, the cellar, all of it pointed toward a truth more horrifying than I was ready for. The Sullivan family hadn't just imprisoned those children, they'd kept them like stock, starved them, experimented on them. Some entries in Elijah's journal hinted at purification rituals, others at strange drawings of symbols etched into the basement floor, symbols I now remembered seeing faintly carved in the stone near the chains. I returned once more to the church, seeking comfort or guidance, maybe both, but when I stepped inside, the pews were empty, the altar candles all extinguished, and in the center aisle, someone or something had dragged a smear of rust-colored dirt in a wide circle. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I knew it was a warning. That night, the smell grew worse. It followed me into sleep. I dreamt I was back in the basement, this time lying on the ground, shackled, unable to move. The sound of tiny footsteps echoed around me. Children whispered, but I couldn't see them. To one leaned down, breath brushing my ear, and said, "You know now, you carry it." I woke gasping, sweat-soaked, the room stinking of rot. I rushed to the mirror. My skin had gone pale, bluish in places. My fingertips, even though clean, bore faint rings where the metal had touched them. And beneath my collar, just over my heart, a mark, round, dark, bruised like iron, had appeared. I hadn't been cursed. I'd been chosen, and now the dead had begun to live inside me. I left the inn the next morning, without a word, packed my satchel in silence, paid the landlady in crumpled notes, and walked until the fog swallowed the road behind me. But no matter how far I went, I knew I wasn't alone. The mark on my chest throbbed with each mile, pulsing like a second heartbeat. The forest around me grew unfamiliar. The birds had stopped singing again, and though no footsteps echoed behind mine, I could feel their presence. Children, watching, waiting. At night when I camped near the roadside, I heard the dragging chains again. Not from memory, not imagined, real, close. One night I woke to find a small dirt-streaked handprint on the flap of my tent. Another morning, a trail of blackened, rust-scented water stretched from my campfire down to the creek. No matter where I went, the Sullivan children followed. I made it to a neighboring town by the third day. It was livelier. People, shops, even a courthouse. I thought about going to the authorities, handing them Elijah's journal, describing the horrors I'd seen. But what could I say that wouldn't sound like madness? That a family in the woods had chained 47 children in their cellar, that their spirits had chosen me as their witness. I tried once, stood outside the sheriff's office for nearly 10 minutes. Then I saw the bruises on my chest in the window's reflection, darkening as if in warning, and I turned away. I stayed in a new inn that night, 2 towns over, clean sheets, a locked door, a crucifix over the bed. But still, they came. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly. My breath fogged the mirror, and on the wall in tiny handprints, something had written, "You left the door open." It became clear to me then, I was no longer just a man who had discovered a terrible truth. I had become the vessel of it. I had stepped into a space the dead could not leave, and in doing so brought them with me. I began to lose time. Hours would pass in seconds. I'd find myself holding the child's journal without remembering when I'd opened it. I wrote things in it too. Entries I didn't recall writing. Descriptions of faces, places, new names. Some of them were crossed out. Others were circled in ink I never owned. I no longer slept through the night. The smell returned even in sunlight. And every time I closed my eyes I saw the cellar. Always the cellar. But now, it was no longer empty. By the end of that week, the child's journal had become my only companion. I no longer knew what day it was, nor where exactly I'd wandered to. Towns blurred, roads twisted in ways that made no sense. But the journal, it seemed to guide me, or trap me. I couldn't tell. The pages had begun to change. Some of the older entries were smudged now, rewritten in a darker hand. New words appeared overnight, ink still damp. The tone of the writing had shifted, no longer frightened, now bitter, angry, commanding. The final entry came one night after a particularly long stretch of silence. I had been sitting in an abandoned barn, sheltering from a thunderstorm, when the journal trembled in my lap. It opened by itself. The last page, once blank, now bore a child's handwriting, jagged, smeared with dark streaks. It read, "He came with the white coat. He gave us water with dark things inside. Some screamed, others didn't wake up. We sang songs so the crying would stop, but they kept coming. We are not bones. We are not gone. We are below. We are waiting. We are in you now." I sat frozen. The barn around me creaked. A sudden gust of wind threw open the doors. Rain lashed inside. I stood, the journal still in my shaking hands. In the corner of the room, the same symbols I had seen carved in the Sullivan cellar now bled faintly from the wooden planks. But I stepped back, my breath catching. The mark on my chest burned, not figuratively, physically, like iron pressed into skin. The children weren't writing anymore. They were speaking, through me, with me. They had left their silence behind, and they wanted a voice. The next morning, I found the barn empty again. The symbols were gone. The journal was blank, but I felt hollowed, like part of me had been scooped out and filled with something not mine. When I tried to burn the journal, the fire refused to catch. To when I buried it, it reappeared by my bedroll the next night. To when I tried to leave it behind, I lost my way until I found it again. The children weren't just bound to that cellar anymore. I had become their memory, living, walking, breathing, and that meant I couldn't forget, ever, because the moment I did, I feared I might become like them. It was raining when I returned to the Sullivan property. The path was nearly overgrown. the weeds reaching high, as if the land itself had tried to swallow the place whole. The trees felt closer this time, looming like sentinels, their trunks black with rot. I didn't remember choosing to come back. It felt like I was being pulled, like something inside me had decided this was where I belonged now. The house stood as broken as ever, its roof caved in further, the porch steps mostly gone, but the front door, wide open, as if it had been waiting. I stepped inside, water soaking through my boots, the boards groaning beneath me. The smell hit me like a wave, thicker, stronger, almost alive. It was worse than death. It was memory rotting in place. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The house seemed to recognize me. The temperature dropped as I passed through the hall. The frames on the wall were empty now. Glass shattered, faces gone. The kitchen still bore remnants of Elijah's twisted cleanliness. Bleached bones, sorted neatly, still labeled with hand-carved initials. But I didn't stop there. I knew where I was going. Down. Back to that cellar. Back to where it all began. I reached the trapdoor. It wasn't locked. Had it ever really been? The hinges screamed as I pulled it open. A rush of cold air met me, wet and metallic. I climbed down the ladder, the same one where I had first seen the chains, the little shoes, the stains on the ground. But the cellar wasn't empty anymore. They were there. All of them. The children, some crouched in corners, some standing, some half hidden behind columns, and old furniture. They didn't speak, they didn't move, but they stared, not with hatred, not even sadness, but with expectation. I stepped forward, unsure if my feet were touching solid ground. I didn't feel like myself. I felt divided, as if I was watching this moment from somewhere behind my own eyes. Then in the center of the room, I saw it, a single open space, surrounded by broken chains, like a throne of rust and ruin, and somehow I knew it was for me. I don't remember sitting down, but when I opened my eyes, I was on the cold earth floor of the cellar. The chains lay curled around me like sleeping serpents, old iron links dusted in filth and memory. The children remained motionless, watching from the edges of the darkness. Some looked barely older than 5, others seemed to flicker between age and ash, their faces hard to hold in my mind. They did not blink, they did not breathe, and yet in their stillness, I felt surrounded by 1,000 whispers, words not spoken aloud, but pressed into my skull like nails. I understood them, not through language, but through feeling, raw grief, betrayal and hunger, not for food, but for justice, for remembrance, for someone to stay. The journal returned to my lap, though I hadn't brought it with me. Its pages were full again, but not with the same broken scroll of children. These were names, all 47, first names, last initials. Some had dates beside them, some didn't. Each name seemed etched in pain, but also reverence. They had entrusted me with their truth, and as I read them aloud, one by one, something shifted in the air. The walls exhaled, the chains vibrated faintly, and I could swear I saw light, not sunlight, not lanterns, but something soft and blue, gather in the corners of the room. It was then I understood. I had become the vessel of their memory, the keeper of their silence, and they had chosen me not to escape, but to ensure it never happened again. Time no longer moved as it should. Days folded into one another. I did not leave the house. I did not eat, but I did not grow weak. I existed in that cellar like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards, writing, reading, listening. Sometimes new names appeared in the journal, names I'd never heard of, with ages and places beside them, other basements, other forgotten children, as though the Sullivan cellar had become something more, a gathering place for every voice lost in darkness. My skin grew pale, my eyes sunken, but I remained, because I could not leave, and perhaps I no longer wanted to. When I finally stepped out of the Sullivan basement, it wasn't because I was free, it was because they allowed me to leave. I emerged not into a world of light, but into a cold morning, choked with fog. My legs felt numb, my skin thinner somehow, like it didn't quite belong to me anymore. I walked into town like a stranger, but the people, they didn't react with surprise. Not a soul questioned where I'd been. Eyes avoided mine. Doors quietly closed as I passed. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just Elijah Sullivan's crime. This was a wound everyone had helped bury. I found Mr. Dyer, the old postmaster, still sitting on his porch as if time had ignored him. I asked him outright, "How long did you all know?" He didn't look at me, didn't even pretend to be confused. He simply took off his hat and set it on his knee. "You think we didn't hear those screams?" he whispered. "You think we didn't see them boys dragging sacks out of that house late at night?" He paused. "We buried what we couldn't face, called it God's punishment, told ourselves the orphans were better off in a home, even if that home had locks on every door." His voice broke, but not with guilt, with exhaustion. "We made peace with the devil, son, long time ago." The truth was even darker than the house itself. The town had known, some directly, others through whispers. The preacher had been warned, and then vanished. A few tried to leave, and their homes mysteriously burned. When food arrived at the Sullivan estate, no one asked who it was for, because they were afraid, or worse, they were complicit. They had made a silent pact: ignore it, deny it, and it would fade. But it didn't fade. It lived on, beneath their streets, in their bloodlines, in the quiet guilt passed from father to son, mother to daughter, and now, through me, their silence had finally found a voice. But I wasn't sure if it was redemption or a curse. The fire began just after midnight, on a windless night that should have been still. I had returned to the Sullivan house with the journal tucked under my coat, something compelling me to visit once more, maybe to say goodbye, or maybe just to be close to the only place that still made sense to me. I was in the cellar when I first smelled the smoke, not the rot, not the mildew, but real fire, dry, angry, fast. I climbed the ladder quickly, heart pounding, throat already stinging. The floor above me had turned into a furnace. The walls groaned. Flames danced up the staircase like red hands reaching for the past. The house had decided it was done remembering. Outside, the blaze swallowed the structure in a slow, almost graceful collapse. I stood a good distance back, watching the Sullivan house burn with the fury of 100 years' worth of buried screams. The night was quiet, unnaturally so. No townspeople came running. No one called for help. It was as if the town had been waiting for this moment, and agreed to let it happen. Sparks shot into the sky like dying stars. Window frames cracked in a final sigh. I saw the chains melt, the old beams crash inward, the floor give way, but not a single sound came from the basement. No screams, no cries, just a strange hum, low and steady, like the house was humming its own eulogy. In the ashes of that place, something remained. Not the journal. I had dropped it when I fled, but it didn't burn. I found it hours later, lying unscathed in the soot. Its cover was cold, damp with something that wasn't water. I picked it up and didn't speak a word. The pages were blank again. Not a single name, not a trace of the children, or their voices, just white silence. And yet I knew they weren't gone. Not truly. Fire doesn't erase a memory that old, it only scatters it. The town had tried to burn its guilt to the ground, but you can't destroy what's already part of your blood. Years have passed since the night the Sullivan house burned. The land is bare now, nothing but weeds and stones. Where the porch once creaked, and the basement breathed, no one built over it. No one dared. The town pretends it never stood at all. Children grow up without hearing the name Sullivan. The school doesn't teach it. The church doesn't mention it. But every so often, I see one of them, someone with eyes too hollow, too old for their face, and I know the chain never truly broke. The journal sits in a box beneath my bed, Sometimes it stays empty for months, then suddenly names reappear. Not 47 anymore. More. Different places, different years. Sometimes they're children I read about in the news. Sometimes they're ones no one ever reports. And sometimes I wake up and find a name I don't recognize, until I meet them in a dream. A dark basement, cold air, always the same silence. I no longer try to explain it. I just write. I record. I witness. I've become the keeper for all of them now. The ones forgotten, discarded, used and buried beneath polite society's gaze. I know one day someone will find me, as I once found that house. They'll wonder who I was, why I disappeared, why I left behind a book filled with names and dates and sorrow. Maybe they'll feel it too, that hum beneath their feet, that itch in the back of their mind when they pass an old building and feel something watching. Maybe they'll open the book, read the first name aloud, and the chain will loop around them next. Because that's the truth I've come to live with. You can burn the house, bury the memory, silence the screams, but the chain never breaks, it only waits.